Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture 103, the final edition for 2025 of the American LGBTQ Museum's new lecture series, Fighting Back, Black Gay Men and HIV/AIDS. We're excited to have you with us to experience this series of lectures about the pivotal moments, challenges, and triumphs of LGBTQ activism across decades. Before we dive into today's talk, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Suhaili Bautista Carolina. I'm the Chief of Programs at the American LGBTQ Museum. I'll be your host for tonight's webinar. I am a Black Latinx woman. I'm wearing gold flower earrings and I have blonde braids. I'm wearing glasses with gold frames. Today's session will explore the vital work of organizations such as the Black AIDS Institute and Gay Men of African Descent, which have fought to center Black voices in the struggle against HIV/AIDS. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to read our speakers' bios. Kevin McGruder is Associate Professor of History at Antioch College. He became a member of Gay Men of African Descent, GMAD, a New York City-based health, education, and advocacy nonprofit organization in the 1980s, while working in the community development field, focusing on affordable housing. He served as executive director of GMAD from 1997 to 2001, a time when the federal government for the first time was making funds available to community-based organizations for HIV prevention services. As an academic, Kevin's research interests include urban history, focusing on racial residential patterns, African American institutions, and LGBTQ history. He has a BA in economics from Harvard University, an MBA in real estate finance from Columbia University, and a PhD in US history from City University of New York. He is author of To Be Heard in Print, Black Gay Writers in 1980s New York, Race and Real Estate, Conflict and Cooperation in Harlem, 1890 to 1920, Philip Payton, the Father of Black Harlem, and editor of Home at Last, the collected writings of AIDS journalist Leroy Whitfield. Kevin is also a board member at the American LGBTQ Museum. Phill Wilson is a multi-hyphenated community organizer, activist, and policymaker. He is an intentionally renowned writer, public speaker, and key opinion leader. He was the founder of the Black AIDS Institute and its president and CEO from 1999 until his retirement in 2019. He was a special assistant to former Los Angeles City Tom Bradley and a former Los Angeles citywide AIDS coordinator. He was a presidential appointee during the Clinton administration and a member of President Obama's Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, PACHA. He has been involved in the founding of countless number of LGBTQ BIPOC, and HIV/AIDS organizations over the last 40 years, including the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum, the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and the National Minority AIDS Council. His work has been featured in Essence Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Advocate, Out Magazine, Pause Magazine, and various other publications. He has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including CNN with Anderson Cooper and Don Lemon Tonight, The Readout on MSNBC, The Travis Smiley Show on PBS, Dr. Oz, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Kevin and Phill to the virtual stage.
Good evening. Hey, Phill.
Hey, Kevin.
Rather than a lecture, we plan to have a conversation this evening. And in my history classes, I almost always use visuals because I find it makes history real in a way that just text and talking doesn't. And so both of us have some slides that Lucy who's on the program staff at the museum, is going to run for us. And then after those, we'll begin a conversation. This is the slide that was part of the advertisement for this event. And pictured here on the left is Colin Robinson. And on the right is Charles Angel. Charles Angel is the key founder of GMAT, and Colin was an early member. This photo is in the mid 80s. It's a demonstration related to the Supreme Court Hardwick decision that criminalized basically sex between consenting adults.
Colin was such a baby.
Yeah. Um, and Colin went on to become the first paid executive director of GMAT, and so felt this picture really captures a lot. And this is in 1986, I believe, when this demonstration was happening. And you can go to the next slide. What I find is a lot of times there's a assumption that recent history will be remembered well, and I find often that's not the case. So I appreciate the opportunity to remind us of the challenge that AIDS and HIV had and still has. This chart, that top red line this is looking at New York City. My work began focusing in New York City in terms of HIV and AIDS. And the top line is new AIDS diagnoses in New York City, beginning in 1981, reaches the peak in 1993, then begins to decline. And that's around the time that the retroviral drugs come on. That other line below is HIV-related deaths, and they follow that same pattern, that peak in about 1994. And then as what we then called a cocktail drug became available, those deaths go down. The bar graphs, the light blue is new HIV diagnoses, and then the darker bars are reported persons living with HIV. And so in a way, this captures the success in some ways that uh, people who did have HIV were not dying at the high rate that they were early on. But it also shows challenges because infections were still happening. You can go to the next slide. And I know you can't see these details, but this slide captures why Black gay men felt called to action. And this is national statistics on AIDS. And the columns, that first column is 1981 to 1987. And the mid portion of that where it says race and ethnicity, in that period, 1981 to 1987, 60% of this is people with AIDS during that period. 60% were white, 25% were Black, non-Hispanic, 14% were Hispanic. And when you move to those next years, 89 to 92, the numbers of white people who have AIDS begins to go down 50%, and Black and Hispanic numbers go up 31% and 17% in that 1988 to 92. And I won't go through each column, but then by that final column, 1996 to 2000, 34% of AIDS cases are white, 44% are Black, and almost 20% are Hispanic. And in terms of Black population, we're still about 13% of population. And so living in New York during that period, we, as Black gay men, we were seeing this with our friends, acquaintances, and that's really kind of what was the impetus for GMAT getting started. And you can go to the next slide. this slide is kind of bringing things forward 2000 to 2013 and its HIV diagnoses. This is also back to New York City, and and I won't go, kind of line by line, but what it does show is that there's a decline from 2000 to 2013 in infection rates, although Black and Hispanic people continue to be overrepresented. You can move to the next slide. In addition to organizations like GMAT, education advocacy organizations in New York City, at the same time that GMAT was getting started in 1986, some of those same people were founding Other Countries, which is a Black gay men's writing collective. Colin Robinson was one of the founders there. I became a member in about 1992 at Colin Robinson's invitation. And this is an article that I wrote in 2005 when I was in working on my doctorate in history. And it's about the history of Black gay men in New York and these writing collectives. There was an earlier collective called the Black Heart Collective that was late 70s, early 80s, and Other Countries came out of that. And then the book, Home at Last, is a collection of the writings of Phill and my friend Leroy Whitfield, who wrote a lot about AIDS. And a lot of times they say journalism is the first draft of history. And so in going back and collecting this and rereading, sometimes many times reading for the first time, it reminded me of just the urgency that we were experiencing. And this came out in 2022. You can go to the next slide. GMAT, it's began as a discussion group meeting in people's apartments, and probably after that first year, moved to the lesbian and gay community center. They outgrew the apartments, and eventually it's a membership organization. Every Friday at the center, there was a discussion. You might have 50 to 100 Black gay men there. And we had a calendar, monthly calendar, and these are some of those from across the years. And you can go to the next slide. In 1996, for our 10th anniversary, we began doing an annual fundraiser, the Angel Awards, after Charles Angel. And I think that's 2006, the picture on the left. And in the right is the GMAT Board of Directors. I rejoined the board in 2010, and I'm still on the board at this point. And next slide. This is a cover of BLK, which is a magazine published by Alan Bell, who's based in Los Angeles, and he has been a major figure in terms of Black gay publishing support in many ways. And this cover also points to the Black gay pride movement, which began, I believe, in Washington, D.C., where often Black LGBT people felt that the pride events, we weren't really, they did not serve us in the way that we needed to be served. And now there's a network of Black gay prides that happen across the country. And I'm going to turn things over to Phill.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I want to start by thanking Suhaili and the American LGBTQ plus Museum for hosting this series. And I am so thrilled to be, in community with the amazing Kevin McGruder. That is always a good thing in the world. My story is, I think, kind of interesting because my entire adult life, including my entire gay adult life, is kind of against the backdrop of HIV and AIDS. And I became really an accidental activist, if you will. This was not my plan at all. And interesting enough, kind of as a coincidental full circle moment. Um, I met Joe Beam before I ever thought about being involved in LGBT plus or HIV/AIDS stuff. Well, I came out in 1980, and right before the HIV/AIDS pandemic, or the pandemic back then was called, in Chicago, and I met my first partner. His name was Chris Brownlee in Chicago, and I was 23 years old, and we just wanted to start, living our gay lives. And in 1982, we moved to Los Angeles. I first became aware of HIV actually in 1981, shortly after the June NMWR report came out from the CDC announcing the strange disease among six white gay men at UCLA Medical Center. As it turns out, that report was incomplete and set a false trajectory of the AIDS pandemic, because in that work with Michael Gottlieb, and he will tell you today that while the first six cases were white gay men, the next six cases were men of color. And so that set us on this road trip of HIV being a white gay disease. So in 1981, my partner had a physical where the doctor said that he had strange lymph nodes. And there's this thing about this disease that was going on in New York. He came home. Turned out I had strange lymph nodes as well. We got those lymph nodes biopsy. They didn't know anything other than they were unusual. We were a part of a gay softball league, and that summer, our center fielder or shortstop player, I think he was, his name was Armando. He didn't show up for practice on a Wednesday, and a month later, he was dead. That February, we moved to Los Angeles. And in June of that year, we started a company, a commercial company called Black is More Than Beautiful. And it was a Black giftware manufacturing company. And we sold calendars and greeting cards and note cards and decorative art targeting a Black audience around the country. And one of our customers was Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia. And Joe Beam worked at Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia, and that's where I met Joe. And he had already started to work on Brother to Brother. And so we talked about the publishing business because I was kind of in the publishing business, and he had this idea that he was working on. And so we stayed in contact with each other. And the rest on that front is kind of history, because Joe eventually went on and indeed published Brother to Brother, which became a very, very important book, a seminal book around the trajectory of HIV and AIDS in Black communities, and just the Black LGBTQ experience. I guess mostly the Black gay experience, and around the Renaissance that was actually happening at that time, primarily in New York, but not exclusively in New York. There were Black gay men that were writing and doing things all over the country. And I started to also get involved in GMAD during those days, not as an activist, but I would come to New York, and if you came to New York, you had to be in New York on Friday night. And if you were in New York on Friday night, you had to go to GMAD. And so out of that experience and seeing that there's kind of a disconnect between the public face of what HIV and AIDS was and my experience of HIV and AIDS, the first person I ever knew was a Afro Latino man, and yet everything you saw was about white gay men. And it speaks to how race plays itself out, because if you unpack the statistics that Kevin spoke about, for example, from the very, very, very beginning, Black folks were disproportionately impacted. The Black AIDS Institute, used to say AIDS in America is a Black disease. So black people have never, ever been more than anywhere from 10 to 13% of the US population. But even the earliest data show that we were 25% of HIV AIDS cases from the very, very beginning. So we were disproportionate from the beginning. So when they say that the face of AIDS changed, that's a lie. We grew, but it didn't change. People just became aware of it over time. And that's important to know because that speaks to the disparities. And women from the very beginning were the majority from that very, very first slide. If you look at the data, black women were the majority of women with HIV and AIDS from the very beginning. So AIDS was always disproportionately impacting black communities. So we moved to Los Angeles and we joined Black and White Men Together in Los Angeles because Chris was a white man, I was a black man, and we were looking for community to support our relationship. And we joined Black and White Men Together. And that organization was already starting to look into HIV/AIDS cases, primarily because so many of our black members were getting sick and dying, and nobody was saying or doing anything about it. And so a number of us began to do local projects. And so Philadelphia had a local project around rap music. Reggie Williams in San Francisco was doing quilts for black gay men. I was starting a workshop and creating a national training called Hot, Horny, and Healthy, was talking about how black gay men could maintain a healthy sex life without risking infection to other people or getting infected themselves, even though we didn't know a whole lot about really the pandemic at a time. And so at a certain point, we decided to bring all of our disparate programming together and created the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, which was the first time that the CDC funded an openly LGBTQ plus organization and coined the phrase men who have sex with men because Jesse Helms was in the Senate and we didn't think there was any way we could get the U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives to approve anything that had gay on it, even though this disease was overwhelmingly impacting same-gender loving men. And so Reggie Williams, myself, and Steve Feedback became the founding staff members of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention. And actually, can we go back to the NEO plan and we'll come back to this slide in a minute. So out of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, I created the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum because I felt that there needed to be a national organization that was focusing on HIV and AIDS in Black communities. Now, as happens with young people, we think that the world as we see it is the whole picture. And that is never the case. The truth of the matter is, while I didn't realize it, the National Coalition of Black, Lesbian, and Gays, with Renee McCoy and Gil Gerald, was already doing work on the East Coast. And Craig Harris was already actively involved in HIV and AIDS. I'm not sure how active GMAT was in the very, very beginning, but obviously, Craig was involved in GMAT in New York. And I was told at a very minimum, if I was interested in doing this work, I had to meet Craig Harris. And so at the National March on Washington, which I think was the 80s, I want to say the 87 March or 86 March. I think I'm going to screw that up. Maybe it was as late as 1988. I participated in that march and met a whole bunch of folks, including Craig Harris and others. And we launched the National Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum. And we did conferences that were ostensibly about HIV and AIDS, although they were primarily about building Black community, because I knew that anything that was going to strengthen a Black queer community was going to be critical in fighting HIV and AIDS. because if we could not find community, there's no way that we were going to mount a response to the AIDS pandemic. And so that's what we did in the context of the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. The first idea was just to do a conference, a one-off conference. That turned into regular conferences, which turned into a national organization that did programming. Uh, Following that experience with the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum, when I left the forum, shortly after that, I actually went to work for AIDS Project Los Angeles and was the AIDS coordinator for the city of Los Angeles. And at a certain point, around 1995, I got really, really sick, and they thought that I was going to die. But I want to go back again. I apologize. So in 1986, I was diagnosed with HIV. I'm sure that when they took that biopsy of my lymph nodes in 1981, I was already positive. But in 1986, that's when I was actually diagnosed. And this is what the HIV testing counselor said to me. He said that he said that I was HIV positive. He told me I should go home and get my affairs into order, and that he estimated that I had 6 months to live. So I had a choice. I could go home and prepare to die, or I could focus on the living. I decided to focus on the living because the dying didn't need my help. Shortly after that, I began to become an activist, and in 1999, I founded the Black AIDS Institute. And our idea was to create a Manhattan Project to respond to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in Black communities. And our first report in December of 2000, I think it was, it may have been 1999, we created this NEA plan. And the NEA plan was designed to encourage all sectors of Black communities to get involved in the fight against HIV and AIDS. Civil rights organizations, health organizations, political organizations, media organizations, medical organizations, entertainment organizations, all had a role to play. And so we worked on creating strategic plans for all those sectors and all of those organizations within those sectors. And out of that, that was the first initiative of the Black AIDS Institute. That also involved getting involved in politics. And so now you can go to the next slide, and if you will. So out of that began a very active work with elected officials, including Bill Clinton, and ultimately meeting and working with the Obama White House. We actually worked with every president from Bill Clinton all the way to Barack Obama and George Bush the second and Joe Biden. We did not work with the current resident of Pennsylvania Avenue, either in this iteration or his first time living in public housing in Washington, D.C. But the notion of involving political muscle in the fight against HIV was one important component, but it wasn't the only important component. Because as Calvin Rolock of the Black Fund said, nobody can save us but us. So primarily what we worked on is getting Black folks to actually focus on AIDS in Black communities. And so when we coined the phrase AIDS in America as a Black disease, it was interesting to me that so many people were upset by that phrasing. Black people said, well, you shouldn't do that because you're further stigmatizing us. Now, I had a unique perspective as a person living with AIDS that I felt like it's better to be stigmatized than to be dead. And I was not so worried about what white people thought of us. I was far more worried about what we thought of ourselves and that we could figure out how to care enough about ourselves to mount a response to this pandemic. So the next slide, please. And so, in addition to that, we also made sure that we engage, Black celebrities and heroes in the struggle and paying attention to people who were fighting HIV and AIDS because the narrative was that Black people were ignoring the pandemic, that Black people were more homophobic than white people. I reject that notion. I don't think that Black people are any more or any less homophobic than white people. I do believe that for Black queer people, the consequences when homophobia arises can feel more consequential. But I don't believe that we are more homophobic than other racial ethnic groups. And so one of the things that we did was try to expose that lie by making sure we were paying attention to activists and allies across our communities. And one of the things we did was our Heroes in the Struggle Awards that started in 2000 and continued all the way through 2019. And that was also a part of engaging and recognizing the full breadth of the fight against HIV and AIDS in Black communities. And that continues to be an important theme for me as we kind of readjust to the assault and the attacks that are happening on us. And I feel very strongly that given the current um, environment that we're in, we should not get it twisted that what's going on, and particularly what's coming out of Washington, D.C., when Keith Boykin asked the question, why does everything have to be about race? Is because it is, Blanche, it is.
What I'm hearing is that GMAT and the work that you're doing, where I'm parallel intersecting paths often during this period. Maybe just to unpack a little bit more about GMAT, we started out as a weekly discussion group. We were not founded as an AIDS service organization, but AIDS had a lot to do with us coming together for the exact reason that Phill mentioned. We knew we needed each other. And that's what coming together every Friday. There are many people who I still am in touch with from those days because of that. There was a tension within GMAT too, is that we were involved in advocacy, um, politics to some extent. We marched every year in the African American Day Parade in Harlem, which doesn't sound like a big deal now, but in the 80s and 90s, it was. They always put us at the very end. It's one of the longest parades in New York. It starts on a Sunday after church and ends at sundown, all through Harlem. And for me, I was kind of pivoting within all of that. I moved to New York in 1982 to go to Columbia Business School, 25 years old, and really trying to figure out what it meant to be a Black gay man because the images were not of us often. And I started looking back to the Harlem Renaissance. And the first meeting of GMAT that I went to was in 1987, and Charles Angel was facilitating. The guest speaker was Arnold Rampersad. He had just published the first of two volumes of the biography of Langston Hughes. And we were leaning forward on our seats as he talked, because by that time, Langston Hughes had become an icon for Black gay men. And we wanted Arnold Rampersad to acknowledge that our belief that Langston Hughes was gay. He did not, because he said he could not find anything in the archives to confirm that. But so GMAT, we had a lot of different kind of meetings. But by the late 80s, we did begin to debate, should we accept funding to provide aid services? And Colin Robinson played an important role in that. Uh, he wrote a grant to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and we got funding in the late 80s to provide HIV prevention services. We were still pretty much all volunteer, but by the early 90s, we started getting funding from the city Department of Health. At the same time, we are doing other things in the 90s. We had a debate about should we go to the Million Man March. Um, there were some homophobic statements that were made by some of the organizers, but some people went, some people didn't. Um, by the mid 90s, we had we had an office, we had staff, and I joined the board in about 1996. And then there was turnover in the staff, and I was working for the Abyssinian Development Corporation at that point in Harlem, connected with the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And that was one of the Friday forums that we had. The pastor at that time, Calvin Obus III, came to uh, speak on a panel with Bishop Zachary Jones of Unity Fellowship Church, which is a national, primarily Black LGBTQ denomination. And they were talking about Black LGBTQ people and the church, and that same conversation about homophobia, is it more that came out in that discussion. Um, I was looking to do something different by 1997, and when there was an opening in the executive director position at GMAT, and decided to throw my hat in the ring, and it was a really exhilarating time, I guess is what I could say. There were a lot of challenges, but some of the political advocacy that Phill is referring to was bearing fruit. At the time that I became director, it's around the time when the Congressional Black Caucus, with Maxine Waters leading the charge, declared AIDS emergency in the Black community, and that funding from the CDC started coming through. We got some of that, and our budget quadrupled over the 4 years I was there because of CDC funding. We operated a capacity building program that was CDC funding, uh, with Maurice Franklin as the director, doing capacity building with organizations in 9 northeastern states in the U.S. Virgin Islands that were serving Black gay men. And the tension within our organization over that was that was definitely needed, but there was a way that there was a loss in some ways, because once you have paid staff, like that kind of feel of everybody, an organization for us, by us, it shifted. And I'm still, I, I know that that was the right thing to do, but it was hard to maintain the old structure as well once we had that. And the other thing that I knew even then, because of my interest in the Harlem Renaissance, that Harlem Renaissance was a fleeting movement, in part because it was fueled by money from outside patrons and that. And I did, even at the time, feel that, okay, we need to prepare ourselves beyond this money, and made some steps to do that. But we did not prepare ourselves sufficiently to diversify our funding streams, and the value of the successes in medication made a shift in terms of focus from prevention to care. And that's both testing and care, getting people tested so they know they're HIV positive. And as early as they know it, they get into care. And once there were medications that worked, because there's about 10 years where there really weren't dependable, but once there were, then that became the focus. And I left GMAT in 2001. That's when I entered the doctoral program at CUNY. But I definitely, I remained in New York, so I was watching what was happening. And the people who followed me, I felt for them because it's one thing to build during a period of expansion, but they were navigating decreased funds, and and then with the presidential administration shifting, there was not as much interest as well. And that story and so GMAD, it went through a downsizing period, and a little before COVID went on hiatus. We're now kind of preparing a relaunch to come back out. But that trajectory is what happened. So I'm part of this panel, not so much because GMAT is the only organization doing this, that was doing this work. In part, I am on the board. I didn't push to be on that panel, but when we were talking about this topic, GMAT does serve as an example. We were part of a network, and this is what Phill was referring to. There's a network of Black gay men across the country. We know each other, we're acquainted, we may be good friends, and there's organizations that were built during that time, and a fair amount of them disappeared in the 2000s. And I'm not as up on the data now in terms of HIV, but we are still overrepresented among infections. Um, the treatment is very effective. The pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is what people who are negative can take, and they're encouraged to take it if they believe that they will have trouble adhering to a safer sex practices. And then the post exposure prophylaxis, where people who are HIV positive, that viral load can be driven down to undetectable, which means they cannot infect someone else. Like 20 years
20%.
ago, that was unimaginable that we could get there. But the disparity in access that we saw with COVID, that's really from the beginning what we were seeing with HIV and AIDS, and also what Phill was referring to in the fact that we were affected from the beginning, but people did not acknowledge it, and we had to push to get acknowledged. And so those are still challenges that we're dealing with now. GMAT's relaunch will have a core element. Vaughn Taylor Akutagawa, who was the executive director when GMAT went on hiatus, he and I and Kevin Coleman, who was in that picture of the board members, we've continued to work kind of in exile almost to try to keep things going. And so we will be relaunching, and the core program will be um, getting Black gay men onto PrEP. And we'll be working with a community health facility in the Bronx. We'll also have telehealth, so we'll be doing um, online therapy, both individual and group therapy. And we have continued to periodically do the Friday Forum. I think my hope is that we'll do that more frequently. In the 90s, if you didn't know anybody in New York, on Friday, you could go to GMAT at 8 o'clock. We met at the center in the village. So if you felt like going out afterward at 10, the village was right there. Then it's a very different village now. And then on Saturdays, you could come to other countries, the writing workshop at 5 and 8, and afterward we went out to dinner. So there was this whole community building that has sustained us. And it's not there now, and I'm not sure that the generation that was the age I was in the 80s kind of realizes what they're missing. That I do know there's an online community, but face to face, there's something different about that in terms of what you can do. Um, and so it's been fascinating to see the changes that have happened. I am kind of looking forward to seeing what's next. Yeah.
So, I don't know if how many questions we have. I know we're going to turn to questions if we have them, but I want to respond very quickly to a few things that you said, Kevin, which are very, very important. GMAT was certainly critical to me, and a lot of organizations had that debate. Do you take federal dollars? Do you not take federal dollars? The notion of us, saving ourselves was kind of an argument. I have to admit, I had kind of a different attitude around that, because I fundamentally believe that those federal dollars are our dollars, and I was very quick to demand that we take pharma dollars because I would say none of these pharmaceutical companies would be making all this money if I didn't have HIV. So they're getting rich on my pain. And so they should be investing in my survival. I think that the mistake that many organizations made is that we did not figure out how to articulate how critical community building is and how essential community building is to access the care and treatment. There is an inextricable connection between building community, building self-esteem, to getting people in, to getting people tested, to getting people into treatment, whether it is therapeutic or preventive treatment, and keeping them there. Today, even though we continue to be disproportionately impacted by HIV, we continue to be disproportionate, unrepresented by those who are on PrEP or on treatment. We have three tools minimally that should mean that no one has to get HIV in 2025 and 2026. We have pre-exposure prophylaxis, which can interrupt the acquisition of HIV. We have post-exposure prophylaxis, which will interrupt infections even after exposure to HIV, and U equals U. That if a person who's living with HIV is undetectable, they can't transmit the virus. Not to mention the fact that if you go on proper treatment early enough, you can have a life expectancy equal to someone who's HIV negative. So we have these tools. We have prevention tools. We have therapeutic tools. We have diagnostic tools. We have surveillance tools. All of these tools lead us to be able to stop the pandemic in its tracks. What we are missing, I think, we continue to be missing community building, and we have a new challenge with political will, not to mention a full-on assault by our federal government on our communities and on our bodies.
Mhm.
And so I hope that as you reimagine GMAT, that one of the things that you don't forget, redescribe, but there is no Black AIDS Institute. There is no Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. None of that would have been had I not found community. And one of the places that I found community was at GMAT. Those sessions, what you just described, that weekend kind of thing, the notion of bringing Black gay men together is absolutely critical. And in California, at least, the strongest organizations are the organizations that understand that. And I'm thinking around about In the Meantime in Los Angeles, Better Brothers LA, and Brothers of the Desert, whose central theme are building community, and they are all thriving, you know.
I totally agree. I mean, what excited me about becoming executive director of GMAT, I had just finished teaching as an adjunct at Lehman. It was a class called Black Economic Development, 1860 to the present. And I was teaching about Black men's mutual aid organizations from the 19th century. And that's really what they were doing. Like in the midst of segregation, they're building community. And so when I became director, that's what I saw GMAT as filling that kind of role. I think the challenge today, there's a paradox that in terms of public kind of culture, like we're LGBTQ, queer, it's all in the kind of the language of society. But there are a lot of individual Black, gay, or same gender loving men who are facing the same challenges that I was in 1980.
Yes.
And all of that general culture, that doesn't resonate with them or give them support. I know a young man who, not that young, he's almost 40, and he he is struggling in ways that are hurting him, like with his identity, his sexual identity. And the reason why I've been so adamant about staying involved with GMAT is because it helped me understand myself as a Black gay man. And once I felt comfortable there, I could do other things. And Bill, that's what you are talking about too, in terms of if somebody really doesn't want to acknowledge their same-sex attraction, then how can you talk with them about care? It's difficult. It's not impossible, but that's a barrier. And if they can find community, and and there's as many ways to be same gender loving as there are to be Black. So
Absolutely.
that's what I loved about GMAT. It's on a Friday. You could see all varieties. And that helped me a lot because I struggled with not seeing myself, and I did there. And and so
Well,
because
and before Suhaili says you guys can talk on your own dime, so I think that that model, and I think the examples that I gave are proof that that model is still needed and is still viable today. The one thing that I don't think that either of us mentioned enough, because you know, you spoke about the the downsizing of GMAD, but critical to that, GMAD more than I think almost any other organization that I know of, so many people died. There was like a bloodbath that happened at GMAD. Like Roy Buchanan and Asado Saint, and and we could go on and on, Craig Harris, we could go on and on and on. And so that whole generation literally died. I have photograph after photograph after photograph in my house where I'm the only person alive. And so I think that the challenge that happened to GMAD, was not even primarily external. No, no, it's just that the engine, you cannot lose that many people, and the overwhelming grief that often was suppressed, that burden just was overwhelming, and because the nature of New York and how close you all live, it was ever present. You couldn't
Mhm.
escape it. You couldn't go go anywhere without, being confronted by it,
Right.
and so we should not lose sight of that,
No, no,
particularly as we
you're
start
absolutely right.
start to rebuild,
But
you
the
know.
flip side of that is you need community even more in times of
That's
grief.
right. That's right.
Because if you are isolated in your grief,
That's right.
that's going to be problematic. You need,
And human nature, so you need to fight that because human nature is we do isolate, we do
right,
withdraw in our grief, and
right.
what.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I totally agree. And um,
so Suhaili, how did we do? Are we in trouble? Will you not speak to us ever again? We're not going to get another invitation. I can know that.
we have questions. Based on your experience, what role does GMAT now play in the larger LGBTQ discourse and trajectory of queer folks in the United States? Seems like a critical element in the story. Um, I would say not GMAT singularly. So in New York, GMAT, it's mainly a New York story. There was a period when we were doing things across the country. But I would say if we open it up to the other organizations that were doing similar work like GMAT, or the new organizations that have followed. So in Atlanta, there's the Counter Narrative Project, which Charles Stevens is running, and
And in
everybody,
Chicago, there's the Chicago Black Gay Men's Caucus,
right,
that Dr. Keith Green is running.
right. And so I think what we can say is that there's another generation that's picked up that baton and is doing what they're doing for what fits where they are. And that's what we were doing in New York. And so the GMAT model is not necessarily something you can just drop down anywhere, but there are certain elements. The community building element is needed everywhere, I would say. And that's um, what's really important. And the second question, how do we encourage and uplift our stories for younger generations, especially given the importance of community building? Um,
The American LGBTQ plus museum. We need to tell our stories.
yeah,
We need to write about our stories. We need to celebrate, our existence. We were there.
yeah.
No, we need to counter the lie that we were involved in this fight and continue to be involved in this fight, and played, seminal and pivotal roles in this fight and continue to serve today.
And a community building organization that I had failed to mention is Adoti, which gets started in 1986. A community building organization gets started in Philadelphia, but eventually has chapters in several areas of the country. They have annual retreats.
They
Um,
still have annual
They
retreats, by the
still
way.
do. Yeah, they're going strong. And so Adoti, GMAD, and other countries, representatives, we've been meeting for several months. Next year will be the 40th anniversary of all three of our organizations. And we have common members across them. So they're not like separate. There are some people who are in all three. And our plan is in the fall of 2026 to mount an exhibition of the histories of these three organizations in New York, and then complement that with programming, probably online programming in other parts of the country as well. And so another way to tell the story. There are some documentarians who are starting to work on things. I know I've been approached by oral historians who are asking about this period as well. Um, Even in thinking about this event, there are several books that I would recommend. One, The Boundaries of Blackness by Kathy Cohen. The subtitle is AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics. Came out in 1999. Kathy Cohen is a Black political uh, scientist at University of Chicago. And she looks at the response of the federal government, the Black community, and also that misreading of the epidemic by the CDC in that, as well as how grassroots organizations filled the gap. And then a more recent book is this book, To Make the Wounded Whole by Dan Royals, and it came out in 2020. And the subtitle is The African American Struggle Against HIV and AIDS. And he has a chapter on GMAT. He interviewed me, Colin Robinson, and Joe Presley, who was another one of the early executive directors, and others, and also talks about other national organizations that are involved, were involved in that period. Um, Other countries started in 1986, and uh, by 1988, we had published our first anthology, and it's Other Countries, Black Gay Voices. And that title of the article I wrote about other countries is from a letter by Carrie Allen Johnson, who was one of the editors of this, because there was a debate within them. Should we publish? Is that going to take away from the workshop? And Carrie wrote a letter saying we need to be heard in print. Um, Understanding that there's a way that that survives when conversation doesn't. And so this came out in 1988. And then in 1993, we did a second anthology, Sojourner, Black Gay Voices in the Age of AIDS. And both of these are still in print at the firepress.com, which is a small publishing entity that I operate. So there are some ways there, but Phill, I'm sure you're aware of other ways that we can tell this story. And
Well, definitely we need to write more. We need to do more exhibitions and what have you. I'm currently working on my memoir. I'm also working on an exhibition that may happen next year on that's going to focus primarily on the Black AIDS epidemic in Los Angeles, but for the I guess the 50th anniversary of the AIDS epidemic, we're looking at a retrospective of AIDS and Black communities and what have you. But I think that the biggest thing is that, Carrier was right, that if it isn't written, it didn't happen. And that's why you see all of these reflections of the AIDS pandemic, and they're all whitewashed, because the white boys wrote it down, and, we have a strong oral history, which is powerful and important, but it is not necessarily does not necessarily serve us when it comes to the historic narrative. And even what has happened is that even those who then write about our history are not us,
right.
and something is lost in that translation. And so one of the things that I've done with my story is to put together a Black team to work on that. So not just a Black team, but also focusing on, since my story is an HIV/AIDS story, focusing on a team of folks who are Black, queer, and also living with HIV as well for the most part. So that it is a story by us, about us, for us, which is an important principle to have. It's not the only principle to have, but it is a principle that needs to be at the table.
And what can help that to happen too is archives that individuals and organizations need to take care and make provisions for where their materials are going to go. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York has the Black, Lesbian, and Gay Archive. They have GMAT's papers, other countries' papers. They have mine. Some of mine, I owe them a lot more because it's been 20 years since I gave them anything. But we need to, and sometimes it's difficult for people to let go of it. But even if you don't have to let go of it while you're living necessarily, but leave instructions for where you want it to go, because otherwise it could go in a dumpster, and that's what happens.
A lot is
A
what has
bit.
happened, particularly
Right.
if we don't have family members that are in tune with that. There's some horrible, horrible, horrible stories about papers that got thrown away.
Right.
Joseph Holmes, who was a remarkable choreographer in Chicago, and his family was so upset that he was gay that they refused for his ballets to be published And so they destroyed the ballets and withdrew permission for them ever to be performed. And that was a whole movement that was lost to that. And so we need to protect ourselves in that regard as well.
Mhm. We have a third question. How important is a third space to the conversation about queerness, LGBTQ experience, and HIV/AIDS for Black queer folks? How important is it in general?
I don't understand that question. I don't think that a third space, I need more definition of what
It
I mean by
it's a concept that our home is maybe the first space, and often our workplace is a second space, but Starbucks is a third space. That's why people work there.
oh,
And cafes are the place. It's not at home, it's not at work, but it's a place where you can, I don't know that people build community at Starbucks, but that's really what, to some extent, what
like
we're talking about.
like the WeWork spaces, but spaces maybe like WeWork that are not for profit and focused on being safe for Black queer folks.
Maybe, but even so, at the height of our CDC funding at GMAT, some of that funding was to create a drop-in center. And that's what that was. We weren't calling it a third space, but that's what it was. And so that's for, I mean, it could be for anybody, but particularly the people who don't have a welcoming home life, maybe don't want to
Want to
be in
break
the,
the isolation?
yeah, don't want to be in the club all the time. And unfortunately, like the way the gay social life was, is that there wasn't other options. I don't know that there are now. I think it may be even more challenging now because there's so much that's online. I know what I see with, I've been teaching at Antioch for 13 years, and I'm seeing a change in the students in terms of some do not have great social skills. And I think that's because they are growing up fairly isolated. And so I think it's even more important now, and particularly for queer folk, because we need to see others.
Yeah,
So we
their
don't need
phones
to
and their
be,
laptops are their best friends.
yeah. And it is, there are ways that can connect, but there are limits to that too. And so I definitely think it's important.
Odell, what is Odell asking us?
He's shouting us out. Odell, who was working at the Lesbian Gay Community Center when GMAT was meeting there. So we go way back. He's on the museum board as well. And, yeah. What role do you play with the Black AIDS Institute now? And
Actually, I don't play any role with the Black AIDS Institute. I made a commitment. I don't know if I want to say this the way I always said it, but what the heck? I said that I was not going to be Dorothy Height and die at my desk, and I was not going to be Jesse Jackson, who stayed past my expiration date. So when I decided to retire, what I said was, I'm going to retire. I'm going to do one thing with the organization, and then I'm disappearing from the organization completely on every level. Um, from the day I retired, I never went back into the office again. I promised that I would actually organize the next Heroes in the Struggle Gala, which I did. And then I discontinued all involvement in the organization because I wanted it to be a clean break. I didn't want it to be one of those pretend departures. I had not witnessed an example where a founder actually could transfer from being the president and CEO to a board member where it was healthy, and I looked at a number of models and none of them made sense to me. So I learned about the Black AIDS Institute like everybody else does on social media.
yeah, yeah, I was in a different situation with GMAT. Yeah, I was involved fairly early on, but I wasn't I wasn't a I wasn't even on the board until they were 10 years into their existence, so it's not identified with me in that way. Those 4 years that I was there, they were exhilarating, but I felt if I didn't leave, my health was going to suffer.
Mhm.
Um, how they have the pictures of the presidents before and after their term. I was feeling that whether I was showing it or not. And so for me, the question was, okay, well, what's next? Like maybe from a career point of view, the natural thing would be to go from a local organization to a national organization like HRC or something like that. But it just did not appeal to me at all. And I had been thinking about getting a doctorate even before I went to GMAT. And so I was 44, and that was too young to retire. And I felt if I didn't do it then, I wasn't going to do it. And so that's how I ended up, applying to CUNY Grad Center, and I wasn't the only 40-year-old there, whereas some of the other places I applied to, I would have been an anomaly. And so it allowed me to gain some of the skills to kind of continue working in this area in different ways. And I also did not wasn't involved with GMAT for quite a while. I rejoined the board in 2010 because they were going through some challenges. So that's, almost 10 years after I left. And and my goal with the relaunch is to once we're on firmer footing, probably cycle off and do something related to fundraising for them or something like that. But that is a challenge too in terms of how you how you leave an organization, selections of successors, all of those things with any organization can be challenges, and with ours, I think even more so.
And I
It,
agree with that, that we spend too little attention on succession planning.
right.
And that was a big deal when I was at BAI and preparing to lead BAI, is that we focused a lot on succession planning.
Mhm.
Both the leadership succession planning, the infrastructure succession planning, and the financial foundation succession planning. So we did a lot of that work, and I was very, very pleased that my successor now actually took the organization to a whole new level that I don't think I would have taken it to for a number of reasons. One of them is that the organization needed a new leadership. The movement needed new leadership, new energy, new skills, uh, and I didn't want to learn the things that one needed to learn and know in order to be an effective leader today, as evidenced by how difficult it was for me to maneuver the technology of just doing this session. No, there are things that I knew one needed to know, and I didn't want to learn them.
Kind of as you look at organizations now in an environment where the funders that were welcoming to us when we were at our agencies, particularly the federal government, is hostile would be a understatement. How how do you think they're doing in terms of plan B, plan C's to keep things going in spite of this?
I think everybody is struggling because it's not just that, for example, the federal government is hostile. No, the federal government is focused on the demise of our institutions and the destruction of us as a people. And so against that kind of assault, it's very, very, very difficult. And now what they're doing is they are targeting potential allies, so they're like, we're gonna take resources away from you, and then we're going to target other people who potentially might provide resources to you, which is unlike anything in the history. Whereas, in the beginning, the at best the federal government, there was benign neglect, and then there is malignant, malicious neglect. No, but at least there was not malicious attack.
Right. Yeah.
Now there is not enough that we're going to ignore you to your, peril. That if we suspect that you might have the capacity to survive, we're going to attack you. We're going to bomb the boat that you're on. And if you happen to swim away, then we're going to bomb you directly.
Yeah.
Even after any imaginable threat has no longer existed, we're going to make sure that you are wiped out.
I mean, I think that's what is behind the impetus for the title of this series, Fighting Back,
That's right.
because like we have to.
Hmm.
Like we don't have any other choice.
You have no other choice.
And creative practices can come
Mhm.
out of challenging times. So, that's what I know is happening, even though I can't name individual examples of that. There's a final question. Can you talk about the tensions that existed between predominantly gay white male HIV organizations and the role of Black gay men, thinking about TAG and GMHC? And we have 5 minutes now.
Well, here's the deal. Um, Maybe I've softened with age, but here's the truth. That again, going back to Calvin Rolark, nobody can save us for us. Other people can't build safe spaces for us, and I think that in the case of all of those institutions, they were focusing on building safe spaces for themselves and those close to them. And I don't believe, no, that the institution building was a um, was malicious exclusion. I don't know if you were at the war conference or if you remember the war conference. Well, the war conference was this conference that was organized by the traditional LGBTQ leadership at the time, and it was held on this plantation in Virginia, of all places. And so when I arrived on Friday night, there were like three people of color. There was me, Urvashi that, and Joyce. I'm drawing a blank on Joyce's last name. We're the only people of color there on Friday night. Other people did show up on Saturday, but on Friday night, no, we were the only three there. And I know that the clock is ticking, so I'll speed the story up. So the first thing that they did was to talk about what do you like most about the I guess it was the gay, lesbian, bisexual community at that point because we weren't embracing trans folks at all. And so this is what they did. The first people got up and talked about the diversity of the community. And I thought, what the F? Are they in the same room that I'm in? And then after that, they talked about caucuses, that there should be the lesbian caucus, and there should be the leather caucus, and there should be the no perfume caucus, and there should be all of these different caucuses. And so it got to me, and I said, I think there should be a people of color caucus, and I recommend that it be in the phone booth in the lobby. And you could have heard a needle drop against a napkin. And they were like so offended And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Look around this room. Joyce Hunter is her name.
Mhm.
And so Joyce then beginning to defend that this is organized out of our Rolodexes. And I was like, that's the problem. First of all, that's not how you organize. And secondly, no, the fact that you organize out of your Rolodex and this is the best you can do speaks volumes about who you are, you know? So anyway, I think that that is reflective of kind of that tension, which is why I felt all along that it was important for us to build institutions, not in spite of them, without regard to them whatsoever. Because whatever those institutions are doing, that's fine for them to do.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, we need to be able to come home to a space and a place and a time and a season and a reason that we own.
Yeah. On that note, I will turn things back to Suhaili. Phill, it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you both. What a powerful place to end this series for 2025 and to end this conversation, or perhaps start and inspire new conversations for attendees. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us. Thank you to Phill and Kevin for saying yes, for sharing your incredible archive and wisdom and experience and inspiration with all of us today. I encourage you to follow the American LGBTQ Plus Museum across all social media channels. Please check out our website to learn more about our programming and about our special projects. Please consider becoming a founding member of the museum. You can click the link in the chat to learn more about that. And also, please subscribe to our monthly newsletter. That's where you will learn more about the 2026 Fighting Back series. There will be 3 lectures, all virtual, and we hope that you will join us for those. If you have ideas for topics that we can cover in the next conversations and lectures for Fighting Back, please email info@americanlgbtqmuseum.org. And I hope to see you all at our final program for the year, which happens next week on December 11th, also online. It is our final author talk for the Lavender Literary Society Book Club. And we will be featuring Tourmaline, whose book on Marsha P. Johnson, Marsha, debuted earlier in 2025. They will be in conversation with American LGBTQ plus board member Imara Jones. And so we hope you will RSVP and join us for that program. Thanks again to Kevin. Thanks again to Phill. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us this evening, and have a good night.